Good evening. Welcome. You're watching visuals right now of the Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is in India. Actually, to be precise, he is in Mamallapuram in Chennai, ahead of the informal summit with Prime Minister Modi that's going to take place in Mamallapuram. There you have Prime Minister Modi on the ground there, visuals of Prime Minister Modi on the ground there in Mamallapuram, where there was a grand welcome for Mr. Xi Jinping as he arrived earlier in the day. As he arrived in India this afternoon to a grand welcome for his second informal meeting with Prime Minister Modi since they met in China's Wuhan in April last year. And he was, before he even landed, greeted by a tweet by Prime Minister Modi, who simply said, "Welcome to India, President Xi Jinping." The two leaders have a packed schedule that includes, for today at least, a tour of the temples of Mahabalipuram, now known as Mamallapuram, and informal and delegation level talks and lunch and dinner meets. And President Xi's visit comes after the two sides, remember, exchanged sharp words over Kashmir following Xi's meeting with the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan just 2 days ago. Now, in a statement after that meeting, China said it was paying close attention to the current situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and also that it opposes any unilateral actions that complicate the situation. Though there was a rejoinder, the Foreign Ministry said that China is well aware of India's position. That is, the position, of course, is that it's not for other countries to comment on the internal affairs of India. This is clearly an internal affair. India has maintained and said that all along. So in the backdrop of that meeting and that statement, we're seeing these visuals. These are the optics, this grand welcome, this red carpet welcome that has been rolled out for Xi Jinping. Now, the key freewheeling one-on-one meeting, or the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, all of that is going to take place on Saturday morning. But today it is all about the optics. Let's go across to Sam Daniel. Sam, so like I'm saying, the big meeting, the important meeting where the talks are going to take place. Yes, the Indian side has said there's going to be no joint statement. They're going to be separate statements. So all of that, of course, is scheduled for tomorrow. But right now, it is about the optics, this warm, grand welcome for the Chinese President Xi Jinping. What's on the agenda for today?
That's right, Sarah. Today is a day they have designated for cultural aspects. In fact, as we speak now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is receiving President Xi Jinping dressed in traditional Tamil dhoti at the Arjuna's Penance in Mahabalipuram. And it was an hour-long drive for the Chinese president from Chennai to Mamallapuram, traveling through the IT corridor and the scenic East Coast Road to Mamallapuram. And now, since he has reached here, a warm welcome by the Prime Minister. They both are talking informally, and after this, they will be spending time on a guided tour, walking to 3 different UNESCO heritage sites at Mamallapuram. They are right now outside the Arjuna's Penance. They will watch this, visit this place, and then walk to the other 2 places, the famous Shore Temple at Mamallapuram and also the 5 Rathas, which display the architectural capability and beauty of the Pallava kings who reigned in Mamallapuram in Kanchipuram district around 1200 years ago, between 4th and 6th centuries. And the very idea of this particular meeting in Mamallapuram is to take them back several centuries before, when the Pallava kings had established trade links with China, in ancient China. In fact, between 4 and 6 AD, there was a vibrant port at Mamallapuram, which also served as a gateway to the South Asian countries and also a gateway for imports and exports from China. And history shows how in that period, even Kanchipuram had a famous Chinese monk visiting after landing at the seaport of Mamallapuram. The story of Huan Swang. And many say this is a perfect setting for both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping to revisit those trade links and to celebrate that relationship India, in a sense, and ancient China have had all these years, all these centuries, and use this as yet another platform to foster new ties, to forge new bonding, so that they'll be able to, over the years, use this bonding, use this new ties to amicably settle many delicate issues, including the pending boundary disputes between India and China. After they go on a guided tour, Sarah, to these three places, Prime Minister Modi would also host a dinner for the visiting president. It will be a one-on-one dinner, and altogether we understand they will be spending around 6 hours together today and tomorrow, one-on-one, informally talking about issues pending between these two countries, issues centering or revolving around neighboring countries, and before they depart afternoon tomorrow. And we understand there will be no joint declaration or joint statements, but they will be issuing separate statements at the end of the two-day-long meet. As we speak, both leaders are entering the Arjunan's Penance at Mamallapuram. Prime Minister explaining the architectural beauty, the historical significance, and the story behind this particular architectural marvel. In fact, all these monuments in Mamallapuram are rock-cut monuments, most of them built, carving out from a huge single boulder or a rock. That's the beauty of these this particular architecture, built by the Pallava kings between 4th and 6th AD, almost 1200 years ago. Both leaders admiring the beauty of Arjunan's Penance. And this is nothing but what we call the story of the descent of Ganges, depicted on these two huge boulders with 146 sculptures, including a huge life-size elephant, many animals, half humans as they call it, and different interpretations for this. Some call it as what was seen as a scene in Mahabharata, some call it as what was seen by in Himalayas, in that legend, as we call it. Both these leaders entering this Arjunan's Penance at Mamallapuram.
In the manner in which these pillars, these structures, these scenes from Mahabharata and other scriptures came into being.
And interestingly, Prime Minister Modi is in Tamil traditional dhoti. In fact, not long ago there was the Hindi imposition, as many called it in Tamil Nadu, had touched a raw nerve, and the Prime Minister during his addresses in the US had talked about the glory of Tamil language, how it's the oldest language in the whole world. And now it's seen as yet another symbolism that he's reaching out to Tamil community in that sense, receiving the president dressed in Tamil traditional dhoti with a shawl around him. After this, both these leaders will be also visiting the 5 Rathas and the Shore Temple. Again, both are beautiful architectural works of the Pallava times in Tamil Nadu. In fact, this place is replete with history between ties between India and China. In fact, many also trace the development of the silk weaving industry in Kanchipuram, which has now become a global brand, to the initial Chinese connections, because it was the silk yarn from China that was brought here through the Silk Route, which this particular Mamallapuram was part of, which later became a huge thriving industry, making itself into a brand well known across the globe. The two leaders, I think now they may stop for the traditional photographs from that point, which will give a clear view of the huge architectural marvel, the Arjunan's Penance here, showing the intricately carved 146 sculptures, all on a huge rock. Many have different interpretations. Many look at this and say what you see in the middle is the flow of Ganges, telling the story of the descent of Ganges. And some say it's a scene from Mahabharata. And this is a famous photograph spot for all those who visit Mahabalipuram to take a picture with this huge architectural marvel at the back.
The subject of this particular motive is Arjuna's penance ahead during the Mahabharata war. This picture depicts how...
Not far away from this place is the other Krishna's butterball, another butter-like looking huge boulder. They may again go walking towards that. But both these leaders looking at the beautiful Arjuna's penance at Mamallapuram, their first stop after President Xi Jinping arrived at Mamallapuram.
There is also it's called Ganga's descent. Many say that the figure in the center, the meditating figure in the center is in fact Rishi Nadu, who is responsible for bringing Ganga.
Sam, we are having, we have the visuals of Prime Minister Modi showing President Xi Jinping around in Mamallapuram. Of course, this brings back those memories and reminiscence, and really is reciprocal for Prime Minister Modi's visit to Wuhan, where President Xi had given him a personal tour of the Hubei Provincial Museum. But of course, so right now the focus, all eyes on the architecture, the ancient monuments of Mamallapuram. Just quickly again, after this, give us a quick look ahead at what is expected tomorrow once the optics are out of the way, and then I can go across to my guests in studio here.
Sarah, the plan after this is a 1 hour long cultural event, then the Prime Minister's dinner, after which the President would return to Chennai while Prime Minister Modi will stay in Mamallapuram. Tomorrow they have a 40-minute one-on-one meeting to begin with, and then it will be the delegation meetings, and after lunch both these sides would give a statement separately, and many talk in terms of the issues that could be discussed. But at the moment, officials say it's a free flow in terms of the subject or the content of the conversation, which they say could include everything, not just the boundary disputes, not just the Kashmir issue, but whatever both the leaders deem it fit to be talked about, so that they'll be able to take it one step closer, at least in terms of resolving them later.
Thanks, Sam. There you can have it. Prime Minister Modi, perhaps for the first time in a lungi there, as he's personally showing the Chinese President Xi Jinping around the ancient monuments of Mamallapuram. Thanks, Sam. We'll come back to you. But what exactly does this mean? Behind the optics, what's on the table? What's on the agenda? What do both sides hope to achieve from this meeting? Let's go across to our panelists. We have joining us now. We have joining us from China, actually, Atul Neja, the Associate Editor for China for The Hindu. We have Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Director of the Society for Policy Studies, and we also have Dr. Zakir Hussain, Senior Research Fellow of ICWA. Thank you so much. Commodore Bhaskar, first to you then. Right now it's all about the optics, but of course there's the backdrop to this. China had crossed the Indian red line of internationalizing the Kashmir issue in support of Pakistan at the UN Security Council over Kashmir. So keeping all of that in mind, what do you expect or think that both sides, India specifically, will come away with or can come away with after this?
Frankly, Sarah, in terms of tangible outcomes, I expect that whatever is finally realized or achieved would be very modest, particularly on those issues where there has been traditional discord, whether it's about Kashmir, Pakistan support to terrorism, the NSG, India getting admission into the UNSC. These are all old chestnuts, and China has made it very clear, even before President Xi Jinping had set out on the visit to India and Chennai and now Mamallapuram. The Foreign Office had issued a statement, and I think you mentioned it in your opening remarks, where it has caused concern in India, but India has also responded. So as an analyst, I would say that on the big ticket items or issues, very little movement, but the fact that the two leaders can speak to each other in an informal setting is, I think, in itself symbolic of a certain positive texture, that while there are some very complex issues on the table, they are able to talk to each other in a very cordial manner, as we can see from the visuals, and perhaps they could address some of the low-hanging fruit, meaning that each other's concerns. These are two very confident leaders. They have come back to the pole position in their countries. Prime Minister Modi has been re-elected with a bigger majority. President Xi Jinping has now got an extended tenure almost for life. And I think they have a vision for their countries. So perhaps they can talk about the areas where they can work together. From the Indian point, I would say the trade deficit is a very, very big ticket item. That if India wants to ramp up its economic growth, it needs to partner with a country like China, which has the scale and where you can bring the deficit down. And the second, if I could quickly add, Sarah, is that today for President Xi Jinping, the BRI is a very, very major flagship. It's a personal project for him. And therefore, if he wants to push the BRI in Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister, had made reference to that. He is going to Nepal tomorrow. If he wants to take it forward there in connectivity, India should be able to arrive at a modus vivendi so that the BRI does not become one more sticking point in terms of China's own game plan for the region.
Correct. So there's a determination on both sides to take this forward, but the reality, of course, there are hurdles on the way. But Atul and Neja, this visit, of course, had been planned. The dates had been picked much earlier, possibly also keeping in mind that President Xi was also going to Nepal next. India has its own concerns about that, but much has changed since then, since when the dates were picked. There's India's growing ties with the Indo-Pacific Quad, and also in the last 3 weeks, we've seen that meeting both President Trump and Prime Minister Modi sharing the stage in Houston. So clearly their relations have also gotten better. Put this in context, give us a picture, keeping this in that context.
Well, Sarah, you're right that in the last 3 weeks or so, in fact, after August 5, the relationship between India and China has taken a hit. There are two issues here. One, of course, is the Kashmir issue and the internationalization of the Kashmir issue by China in support of Pakistan. That's one. But from the Chinese side, the meeting of the Quad and the level at which it has been raised, that is from Joint Secretary level to the level of foreign ministers, is something which has been taken very seriously. So I think these are two big equations. I mean, there's an equation here which is coming up, which needs to be addressed. So this visit really takes place at a time when we need to get back on track. And these two are the sticking points which the two leaders will probably have to address. Having done so, I come back to Bhaskar's point that there are overlapping interests in the Indian Ocean, in South Asia, Nepal, Bangladesh. The briefing which the Chinese gave us before Xi Jinping's departure was about the India-China Plus formulation. That is a strategic dialogue between India and China, which would, where the competing interests would be deliberated upon before either country enters into a third arena. That is, if you're going into Nepal, you will first discuss what is in your mind before going into that. And that, according to the Chinese, should be a formulation that should be applied not only in South Asia, minus Pakistan, of course, but also elsewhere, including Africa and the Indian Ocean. So I think that is a formulation which needs to be worked upon because both these countries have competing interests and they're going to increase, as Bhaskar was saying, that both countries are rising powers and there are going to be frictions which are going to come. But do we have a mechanism to address it? The Chinese are suggesting one. In fact, they did so in Wuhan. But they have reiterated that in terms of the China-India Plus formulation just before President Xi's departure. So I think that's another issue in terms of institutional arrangements that might be required to address issues down the line. That is the strategic direction which the two leaders can give. A, rescue the relationship and to impart a forward momentum, work out on a coherent mechanism in anticipation of the frictions and problems that are likely to arise in areas not just in South Asia but also beyond.
So there are competing interests, there are lots of hurdles, but there's also much at stake, and both sides would want cooperation with each other. Dr. Zakir Hussain, the summit comes as China is navigating a trade war with the US. It's seen months-long protests in Hong Kong. India, on the other hand, as Comrade Bhaskar has already touched upon, we're trying to revive our economy. We're seeing the slowest expansion in 6 years. So even as there are as many hurdles, there are also many reasons for both sides to want to work together.
Yes, of course, both the countries have bilateral, regional and global issues where they can work and solve their problems and add momentum to their economic growth and bilateral relations. But at the same time, China is very possessive to its own relation, especially with Pakistan and other issues like BRI, where we have differences. I think that the problematic issue is that how we can work on this, because China is not going to compromise its interest on these issues, but on trade issue deficit, on CPEC, that is a tariff issue on RCP, on investment issue, 5G issue, which is directly relating to the common interests of both the countries, economic and social and people-to-people relation, it will continue. But China is not ready to give up its position on for its allies. So at the same time, we have also put our reservation that look, these are our red lines, we will not cross. So at the moment, world is looking that there is a standoff between the two countries, but there is a willpower with both the leaders to sustain their relation, because both cannot afford to annoy each other, because they are big economies. Without their cooperation, they cannot grow. This is my understanding, and Prime Minister Modi has already demonstrated his willpower domestically as well as on foreign policy by carrying several issues, several policies which has of course annoyed China. So this is and I think that this is a good attempt, though we don't expect too much from this meeting. But what I feel that diplomacy is a term of engagement. In one shot, say 2 shots, so it shows the affirmative passion of both the leaders, where the chemistry of the two leaders can also work. But right now, I don't feel that any breakthrough will take place on Kashmir or China or Pakistan or anything else like that.
All right. And Comrade Bhaskar, that's exactly the sense the External Affairs Ministry has been trying to give everyone, also trying to dampen any enthusiasm. You know, usually the way you see the press pounding their doors asking for what, you know, what's going to be achieved, what are the big announcements that are going to be made. The MEA has made it clear, as they've been putting out sources, telling anyone who would listen, this is an informal summit, it is unstructural, no MOUs, no joint statement, it's just an exchange of views. So they're also, you know, clearly, strategically setting the bar very low here.
Sarah, I hope I can get away with this, which is to sit in your studio and say that perhaps some of your colleagues in the TV channels have run away with the bit, because I think some of the coverage has been perhaps excessive and very, I think,
won't
hopeful.
be the first time.
But I think more seriously, I think you're right about this, which is that the MEA has already, I think, conveyed that this is informal. That's the first point, which is why the welcome accorded to President Xi Jinping when he disembarked this morning from the aircraft this afternoon was like a carnival. You know, it was like a little mela with children dancing, drums, etc., etc. So that's the first point. The second is they also said no statements, that if at all both sides may put out something individually, but there would be no agreement on word and commas and phrases. So do not expect that. And also that this was about the two leaders having an opportunity to have a candid exchange quietly in camera about a range of issues, because apart from whatever we are saying on the bilateral front, whatever is specific to Southern Asia, Asia itself is going through a very complex kind of churn. We can see what is happening in West Asia. We can see what's happening in terms of Turkey. The United States is going through its own dissonance. Europe has got Brexit. So I'd imagine that two Asian leaders, you know, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, who are politically very astute, must be giving this some kind of thought about how do they want to position their countries, because they also have bilaterals with all the other countries we spoke about. And a last point, if I may, Sarah, which is I think this is also a demonstration of Prime Minister Modi's personal dexterity. I mean, remember the images from Houston, where we had the Howdy Modi and the way in which he could relate to the US President, Mr. Donald Trump. And now here we see him in Mamallapuram able to have a similar kind of personal one-on-one with the Chinese President, which I think in a way adds or burnishes Prime Minister Modi's own credentials as a global leader today who has this ability to engage and also use social media and so on. So it's a very kind of, I would say, deft kind of packaging of Prime Minister Modi himself. Sarah?
Correct. So the important point that you've mentioned, of course, the fact is that there are bilaterals with other countries too, and India is, part of Asia. We have our neighbors, and China has an independent relationship with each of our neighbors. So, Mr. Atul Arneja, again, like you just touched upon Nepal from India, Xi is now heading on to Nepal for a state visit, and that's a move that New Delhi will also be watching closely because China has made considerable inroads in Nepal, traditionally under India's sphere of influence in the region.
Sarah, just before I come to Nepal, I just want to make a small point. You see, I think Prime Minister Modi recognizes that we are in a multipolar era. Now, just before he went to the US, one of the underreported events has been his visit to Vladivostok, where he met President Putin, and over there also declared a look far east policy along with investing billions of dollars in the oil and gas sector. So it's interesting that he goes to Putin, meets him in September, then he goes to the United States for the Howdy Modi event, and thereafter he meets Xi Jinping. I mean, it's just a reflection of the appreciation that we are in a multipolar era and we need to equally engage all the principles.
Correct.
Now, second point about the comparison, I don't think we should underplay this visit because Wuhan, though it came after Doklam crisis, was exactly structured in this manner as the Mamallapuram informal summit.
Correct.
There was no MOUs. There was there were again separate statements issued by India and China. It's following exactly the same script as Wuhan.
Correct.
Now I mentioned a third point about Nepal. I think what's really happening is that on the Indian side, I think it's important that we link Nepal with some solution on the border, because if you're going to have a railway coming from Tibet into Nepal, then today Chinese say that it is for commerce, etc. But till we have a resolution on the border, I think it will be legitimate for India to say that today you have commerce, but tomorrow you can have troops. So I think we need to go for the BCIM first, which is a done deal, and persuade the Chinese to look at solving some issues on the border, and then go ahead in a cooperative mode on Nepal, because that would have created the comfort level before we get on to that. Please remember that today the Russians are about to send a pipeline into Beijing. This would have been impossible because 1969 they had a border skirmish with the Chinese. But they resolved the border in the early 2000s, and now they can do this mega project. I think we need to follow sometimes when it comes to our neighboring countries, especially Nepal. We probably have to draw a linkage between some traction on the border and endorsing mega connectivity projects in countries like Nepal, which link up the railway from Nepal into Tibet.
All right, so that's a valid point. India hoping to repeat the Wuhan formula exactly along the same lines, and much was achieved there since the Doklam standoff. The sustained engagement really between both Xi and Prime Minister Modi have brought Beijing and Delhi closer. On that note, let me quickly go in for a short break. We'll come back to all our guests in studio and more of these visuals coming in from Mamallapuram. Stay tuned. Welcome back. What you're looking at on your screens are visuals of Prime Minister Modi personally giving the Chinese President Xi Jinping a tour of some of the ancient monuments in Mamallapuram, where the President of China, the President Xi Jinping, is right now for a 2-day visit. He arrived in India this afternoon to a grand welcome This for his second informal meeting with Prime Minister Modi since they met in China's Wuhan in April last year, where we actually saw these visuals in reverse, where it was the Chinese president giving the Indian Prime Minister a personal tour there, and now we're seeing it the other way around. India returning the hospitality that was shown to Prime Minister Modi in Wuhan, the red carpet that was rolled out for Prime Minister Modi in Wuhan. All of this began, this grand welcome began with a tweet from by Prime Minister Modi simply saying, "Welcome to India, President Xi Jinping." Now, the two leaders have a packed schedule. It includes, apart from, the tours of the temples of Mahabalipuram, now known as Mamallapuram, it includes informal, it includes the delegation level talks, lunches and dinner meets. But not to be missed is the timing of all this. President Xi's visit comes after the two sides exchanged sharp words over Kashmir. This following President Xi's meeting with the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan just 2 days ago. In a statement after that meeting, China said that it was paying close attention to the current situation in Jammu and Kashmir and that it opposes any unilateral actions that complicate the situation. Though there was a rejoinder, the foreign ministry said in China is well aware of India's position and it is not for other countries to comment on the internal affairs of India. So I want to go back now to my guests. We have a Commodore Siyodhe Bhaskar, Director of the Society for Policy Studies, and Atul Aneja, who is the Hindus correspondent there, who's joining us from China. So, in the first half of this bulletin, we discussed the optics, all the low-hanging fruit, the expectations being very low and set very low by the MEA. But now I want to focus on the elephant in the room. Let's talk about how this relationship really has now been complicated by the Pakistan factor. What are we expecting Prime Minister Modi, Commodore Bhaskar, first to say to President Xi about whether Beijing should be more sensitive towards India's concerns on Kashmir? Pakistan has always been an issue when it comes to India-China relations, but now it just seems to have gotten a lot sharper.
Well, Sarah, I would say there are two strands here. One is, I think, the whole challenge of terrorism, and we are aware that Prime Minister Modi, even going back to Modi 1.0 when he assumed office in 2014, has been drawing global attention to the challenge of terrorism and urging what he often calls as a collective response. Now, it's within the region that China, being the proximate neighbor of both Pakistan and India, has provided what can only best be described as uncritical support. And no amount of exhortation by India has made any difference, because it's not as if China does not know. I mean, the whole global community, from political leaders to intelligence agencies to all the security professionals, are aware of the fine print as to how Pakistan is invested in terror. That's not news. I think for Prime Minister Modi, the challenge would be to convey this to President Xi Jinping in as persuasive a manner as is possible, to say that this is really the bone that sticks as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned. And is there any way of quarantining it? Because I'm repeating this point, it would not perhaps be prudent or practical to expect that China can in any way de-link from Pakistan, which seems to be on the wish list of, as I said, some of the interlocutors that we mentioned earlier. I don't think that's going to happen. But can we quarantine that and then move on to the other, which is an equally complicated issue, which is the moment you talk about Kashmir, and Prime Minister Modi has taken this decision on August 5th, it is a very, very major domestic political decision for him. Now, this links up with territoriality, and both India and China have very high sensitivities on territoriality. China Tibet, China Taiwan, China Hong Kong. For India, today the Kashmir issue has got more complex because China is sitting on one part of the composite state of Jammu and Kashmir as it existed in October 1947. So these, I think, are the kind of issues that perhaps Prime Minister Modi would be able to convey, because the next link is with BRI. If you recall, the reason why India had opposed China or did not join BRI was again because of territoriality.
Yes.
So I think these are the issues that terrorism, territoriality, and the way in which China has positioned itself is there any give that India could possibly expect? And if so, what is the most practical way of doing it, considering, let me repeat this, India has not said a word in public about Hong Kong. It hasn't said anything about the detention of the Chinese citizens of Muslim faith. And I think these are issues that Beijing is keenly aware of. Sarah?
Despite Beijing actually bringing up human rights issues, despite all of this at the UN when it comes to Kashmir. But Atul, you know, the former National Security Advisor, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, has argued that China is leaning more now towards Pakistan. Like I've said, Pakistan's always been an issue when it comes to Indo-Chinese relations, but it seems to have gotten worse. And according to Mr. Menon, at least, this is because of the thickening of India-US ties. He says this has provoked a natural rebalancing, leading China to move closer to Pakistan that India was slow to anticipate.
Yeah. To respond to your question, first thing, that the Chinese understand that if their Belt and Road Initiative is to fly, then Kashmir has to be resolved. Bhaskar mentioned about CPEC, and that's their flagship program for the BRI. So it's interesting that since March this year, Foreign Minister Wang Yi has gone on record to say that China is interested in mediating on Kashmir. He used this remark in March this year, which of course India rejected. Now, thereafter, at the Bishkek SCO summit, I've been told that President Xi himself broached the subject of mediation of Kashmir with Prime Minister Modi, which was again politely declined, as Prime Minister Modi politely declined when President Trump offered to mediate. But the Chinese are persistent on this. Now, Bishkek summit takes place in June. Now we have the third dimension of August 5 coming in, where the situation changes. And that's where the linkage with the Quad becomes even more intense. And there I agree with the former Foreign Secretary Shiv Shankar Menon that with India, in response to what happened to the Chinese response to August 5, went ahead and did two things. One was postpone the border talks, which are supposed to be held in September between NSA Doval and Foreign Minister and State Counsel Wang Yi. The second step which India took was in last month at the UNGA, when it agreed to raise the level of Quad meeting from joint secretaries to the level of foreign ministers. So there is a shift in that position. Now, what has China done in response? There's a back and forth going here. Before coming to India, China literally summoned both the pillars of power in Pakistan. Not only did Imran Khan come over there, but Army Chief Qamar Javed Bajwa was there, and the ISI Chief, Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid, was also in Beijing just 2 days ago.
Correct.
Now, that I think is a linkage with what's happening in the Quad. Meaning that if India goes and weaponizes Quad, in the sense goes ahead and beyond what it's done now, then the signal is clear that China will bond even closer with Pakistan. And I think that's the two equations which come into play when President Xi lands here in Mamallapuram and right now beginning his talks with Prime Minister Modi.
That's right. I read your piece in The Hindu where you're saying that Beijing also has a plan B if the strategic calculus of both these neighbors doesn't work out. So what you're saying is because President Xi is personally also invested in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, he's particularly keen that Kashmir has to be resolved for that to move forward.
Sure. Sarah, just to clarify here, I think from the Chinese perspective, when I sit here, there is no zero-sum game from the Chinese side. For the Belt and Road, China needs both India and Pakistan. It's not the zero-sum. It's not either India or Pakistan. And I think that's where, from the Indian perspective, we have to understand that Chinese will not abandon Pakistan, especially given the fact that Pakistan gives China strategic access to the Indian Ocean through Gwadar because it wants to avoid passing it straight to the Malacca Strait. So this is a strategic objective, and this is what will bind China and Pakistan. While, with the trade war coming in and China being further squeezed by the Americans, China wants a relationship with India as well, and a bigger trade relationship and trade and investment relationship, and as well as other parts of the world, also on the global issues like climate change, etc. So there is a bigger framework within which the China-India relationship is being sort of located.
All right, I want to talk about, the third angle here in the equation, of course, the economy right now. But quickly, Atul, since you're in Beijing, before I go into a short break, if you can just quickly tell us, what is the press coverage like in China over this visit? What are the Chinese expecting out of this?
Well, the Chinese, you see, they have actually been very positive about this visit. We had the briefing day before yesterday, and Chinese state media has gone and given extensive coverage to the Chinese perspective on this visit, which is quite positive. And as we speak, the China Global Television Network is on, and they are giving the same visuals that you are showing on your channel. So there is considerable interest and also a spin given by the Chinese, which is pretty positive, and sort of isolating it from the other contentious issues which we have spoken of.
All right. Thanks so much. I'm going to come back to both of you. Let's quickly try and take a short break. Come back. Again, we have these visuals playing out from Mamallapuram. Prime Minister Modi in a Veshti, perhaps for the first time, sitting there in diplomacy over coconut water with Prime Minister Xi. We are going to come back to this and more after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. What you're looking at on your screens are visuals of Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping sharing a moment over coconut water. Prime Minister Modi perhaps possibly for the first time in a Veshti there as he greeted the Chinese President Xi Jinping in Mamallapuram for an informal summit, a packed schedule that includes informal and delegation level talks, lunches and dinner meets. Right now what you're looking at is Prime Minister Modi and President Xi just taking a little break, resting for a bit after Prime Minister Modi personally took the Chinese President Xi Jinping for a tour of the temples of Mamallapuram, otherwise earlier known as Mahabalipuram. That's what we would have visited as children to Mahabalipuram. This was a tour hours after President Xi arrived in Chennai to a grand welcome. This for his second informal meeting, I beg your pardon, with Prime Minister Modi since they met in Wuhan in China in April last year. That time we were seeing the very visuals, but in the reverse. There we had President Xi personally taking Prime Minister Modi around for a tour there in Wuhan, and at that point of time Prime Minister Modi had invited President Xi to India for a reprise, and this is where we are today. President Xi now returning to India for the next level of their informal summit. And you have Prime Minister Modi there. You're getting a full-length visual of Prime Minister Modi in a crisp white Veshti or lungi as it's known, the white traditional attire of Tamil Nadu known as the Veshti, they're walking about the rocky lawns of the temples in Mamallapuram. They have a packed schedule. There is, of course, that informal delegation level talks, the stress on informal, because the MEA has made it clear that this is an informal summit. It is an unstructured summit. There's going to be no MOUs. There's not going to be a joint statement. This is just an exchange of views. And but of course, despite the optics, the fact is that this visit of President Xi comes after the two sides exchanged sharp words over Kashmir, not just after China's statement at the UNGA, but also after Xi's meeting with the Pakistani Prime Minister just less than a little over, I should say, 48 hours ago. So the big meetings are all going to take place tomorrow on Saturday morning. We'll have full live coverage of that. But as of now, this is the warm-up to that key freewheeling one-on-one meeting between Prime Minister Modi, where Prime Minister Modi is personally taking President Xi on a tour of the ancient structures in Mamallapuram in Tamil Nadu. And here they are left for a moment by themselves without the translators. And let's zoom in there, right there for that photo op. Prime Minister Modi and President Xi in Mamallapuram for their second informal summit. Let's quickly take a short break. We'll bring you more on this and all the other news from around the country after that.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi today took Chinese President Xi Jinping for a tour of the temples of Mahabalipuram, now known as Mamallapuram, hours after she arrived in Chennai to a grand welcome for his second informal meeting with Prime Minister Modi since they met in China's Wuhan in April last year. The Prime Minister also tweeting, "Welcome to India, President Xi Jinping." As you can see there, the Prime Minister attired in a crisp white traditional attire of Tamil Nadu called the Veshti, which would definitely win hearts in the state, where the BJP, of course, is looking to make inroads. Now, the second destination that both the leaders visited was the Panch Rathas, the carved temples carved from single rock. Now, the two leaders, and they're actually now at the third destination, which is the Shore Temple, where there will be a cultural program as well, and dinner also will take place here. Now, the two leaders have a packed schedule that includes informal and delegation level talks and lunch and dinner meets. President Xi's visit comes after the two sides exchanged sharp words over Kashmir following Xi's meeting with Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan 2 days ago. Prime Minister Imran Khan was in China. Now, the key freewheeling one-on-one meeting between the Prime Minister and President Xi will take place on Saturday morning. Government sources have been maintaining that the informal summit is totally unstructured, so there will be no MOUs or joint statements emerging. The aim, they say, is to build contact at the highest level and exchange views on key issues. The two leaders will have 6 hours talks, and separate statements will then be issued. That's what government sources have told NDTV. Sources say that terrorism, including training, financing and any other support to terror groups, will be one of the key issues to be discussed. Of course, there's a trade as well, and that is a sore point of sorts for India, given the trade deficit is over $50 billion in favor of China. So that is something that India is looking to improve on. Also, as we said, separate statements will be released later. There you can see the sightseeing taking place at the Shore Temple complex. Let's go across to Sam Daniel now for more. And Sam, first and foremost, have to talk about the Prime Minister's attire, wearing a traditional Veshti, and something that will win hearts in Tamil Nadu.
That will have to wait and see, but certainly a good gesture by the Prime Minister Gargi to wear the traditional Tamil Veshti and the traditional angavastram, or the shawl, as he received visiting President Xi Jinping. And as we speak now, it's almost an hour since President of China visited or arrived at Mamallapuram, and both these leaders are on a guided tour walking to 3 UNESCO heritage monuments. The first one was the Arjuna's Penance, second one was the 5 Rathas, and as we speak now, they are at the Shore Temple overlooking the Bay of Bengal, the signature picture of Mamallapuram, the 5-storied Shore Temple, which is the showpiece of the Pallava architecture built by the Pallava dynasty, and it's a 700 AD architecture. And as we speak now, the Prime Minister appears to be explaining the historical and the cultural significance of this monument. And in fact, the very locale itself signifies so much of cultural and business ties with ancient China. In fact, Mamallapuram, around 1200 years ago, was a vibrant port city which served as a gateway to China as well as South Asian countries, and the Pallava kings at that point in time had already established trade ties with China, exporting spices to China, and it was the silk yarn from China which led to the flourishing silk weaving industry in Kanchipuram, which has now emerged to be a global brand by itself over several centuries. And many feel this symbolism of these two leaders walking at this place rich in history in terms of their business and commercial ties over several centuries, could lead to a kind of celebration of sorts as they walk across this town. Also forge new ties, new bonding to be able to amicably settle many pressing, delicate issues, including the border disputes between India and Pakistan. And this is the final stop for them. After this, the Prime Minister will host a dinner for the visiting President. We understand it will be completely local cuisine, Tamil traditional cuisine served at this particular dinner. And then they would meet tomorrow again at 10 o'clock for a one-on-one meeting for 40 minutes. And then there would be a delegation level talks, after which both countries would issue statements separately about this two-day informal talks. So lots of symbolism, lots of pride element for Tamil Nadu. Particularly this comes after so much of anger against the central government over the attempts by what many here saw it as an attempt to impose Hindi, particularly the speech made by Home Minister Amit Shah. But after that, the Prime Minister reached out to Tamils, talking high about the pride of Tamil language, how it's the oldest language in the world, and now he is in yet another way has reached out by wearing Tamil traditional Veshti and angavastram. In fact, although politically many opposition parties here do not see eye to eye with Prime Minister Modi in this aspect, as far as the Indo-China informal summit talks at Mamallapuram, everybody is quite happy, and they in fact thanked the Prime Minister. The Chief Minister also asked people in Tamil Nadu to wholeheartedly welcome. So a slice of Tamil culture, a slice of rich Pallava's rich architecture, which gave this kind of UNESCO heritage monuments to Tamil Nadu, being showcased to the visiting President. And next stop will be at the dinner side area, where the Prime Minister would host the visiting President dinner later in a short while from now.
All right, Sam, and there we can see the External Affairs Minister Jai Shankar is there, Ajit Doval is there, and now the delegates also, I think, now going to come together for those informal talks or interaction.
Delegation to the Chinese President Xi Jinping.
That's right. Now it's day one is completely dedicated to cultural activities, Gargi. They would also have a 1 hour long cultural presentation made by the Kalakshetra school, the famous Kalakshetra school in Chennai, by students and performers from that institution. After which they would have the one-on-one dinner. And yes, as we speak now, the Prime Minister is introducing, the Chinese delegation is being introduced to the Prime Minister here. And in a sense, much of the one-on-one interaction is coming to an end, and they would go for the cultural presentation, followed by the dinner at an area close to the Shore Temple at Mamallapuram, Gargi.
All right, absolutely stunning location there. Look at those visuals that they're showing us of the Shore Temple, and really putting the spotlight on Mamallapuram. Of course, it is renowned, and these are all UNESCO heritage sites. But even so, the significance of Mamallapuram also given, it's got historical significance given the fact that there were ties here hundreds of years ago between the Pallava leaders, the rulers, and ancient China. Well, to talk more about this two-day informal summit, we're joined here in studio by Major General G.D. Dwivedi, Professor of Strategic and International Relations, and someone who's worked and has written on China extensively, and Prabhu Dayal, a former diplomat and ambassador. General Dwivedi, this visit so far very high on the optics, the photo ops, the symbolism. Of course, Prime Minister Modi also scoring points in Tamil Nadu as far as politics goes, given of course the location of this summit, as well as the fact that he's dressed in the traditional attire. But beyond that, how much substance do you expect from this two-day summit, and also given that the irritants that have taken place between India and China of late?
Well, such informal meetings do have certain amount of substance, as they have the optics of symbolism. And let me just take you as to, after all, when the meetings take place, they have certain agenda which is not formalized, but which is quite in the informal terms, because after all, they are very broad canvas on which the leaders go and discuss the issues. Let's go to first one in Wuhan. that happened in April last year, 2018.
Very different circumstances.
Yeah, the
very different
whole context was different. Xi Jinping had emerged as the leader after Mao Zedong, and he had made very categorical two visionary statements to China. First visionary statement was that China will be a prosperous and a powerful country. He laid down his dream, and then he laid down two timelines. By 2035, the China will be a modern economy, and by 2050 a superpower. Now that's the narrative he started 2018, but after, it was in the backdrop of Doklam, and Xi Jinping will not want anything that actually distract or derails his China dream or what he has laid out for the people. Now that summit was in the backdrop of resetting the relationship with India, because if India is in the opponent camp, the Chinese dream may not be realized. That's what Xi Jinping, I think, he anticipated, and therefore our Prime Minister went in there primarily to reset the relation, to have a strategic guidance, to have a strategic communication, because it's very important for the leaders to be able to communicate, with certain amount of trust, and also to try and come on certain convergences. Now that was the backdrop of Wuhan. Now let's take what's the backdrop of Mahabalipuram. Now what has happened is, in these 18 months, the things actually have not gone as per anticipation. There are a number of irritants which came up. Some of the irritants which majorly are, firstly, the deepening relationship between China and Pakistan. They already had a very substantial strategic relation, but it has got further deepened. Now, and that deepening is not in India's interest. In fact, it is working against India's interest. And when you bring in the Kashmir factor, on which China had made statements which almost impinge on India's internal affairs, and which have been rebutted at various forums. Second very major issue is the terrorism. Now China sees terrorism from bifocal lens. What is happening in Xinjiang is one form of terrorism. What is emanating from Pakistan is another form of terrorism. Now this had to be actually brought to the notice of the Chinese leader, that terrorism doesn't have any shades of grey, black and white. It's one shade. Third very important point is China's inroads into our neighborhood. You see, Bangladesh has very strong relationship with China. Pakistan, of course, not to mention Nepal. Xi Jinping is going to Nepal.
And he's going to Nepal, in fact,
he's going to start,
the talks
talk
with
about the railway
Modi.
line from Shagaze to Kathmandu, and that has a very important strategic significance. And lastly, trade. We are having a $53 billion deficit against China. China has not opened a market substantially, and ours is a very imbalanced type of trade. So I think these sort of forums give you opportunity to put across your point in a more candid manner, because you are not bound by the MOUs, protocols. So it gives you freewheeling space. And I think from my side, Mr. Modi should be very candid to put across his points, our worry about China-Pakistan relationship, our worry
and
about
our
terrorism.
sensitivities towards Kashmir. I'd like to get Ambassador Dayal in now on this issue. And sir, so what are your expectations from these 2 days of freewheeling and informal talks that are taking place? As General Dwivedi was saying, perhaps on the issue of Pakistan and terrorism, we can try and make a point, but unlikely that we will gain much ground there. But the issues that are irritants, where we could try and focus on, is the trade, the trade between India and China, and how unfair it is, and it's stacked towards China, and also the border issues that continue to be an irritant.
Well, I agree with General Dwivedi entirely, because the relationship with China is full of problems. It's a very thorny sort of relationship. You mentioned the border issue. The border dispute has been there since long, and I don't see it getting resolved anytime in the near future. However, an attempt is being made to clearly demarcate the line of actual control, because there are a lot of incidents which keep taking place because of the lack of proper demarcation. So I think there could be some attention given to this, and that may alleviate the situation in the immediate context. Then we come to the issue of Pakistan. Now, Pakistan has been used by China as its pawn. China, all said and done, treats us as an adversary. China considers India as a potential rival in the region and also perhaps in the emerging scenario, a global rival. And China would like to cut us to size, and for this purpose, it encourages Pakistan, it assists Pakistan, and I do not see its attitude changing in the near future. However, I believe that there are no permanent friends and no permanent interests. There are only permanent, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, I repeat. Now, if Chinese interests in India can develop, then we can expect their hostility towards India to come down a bit. And I think the Prime Minister is attempting to do precisely that. He has engaged in informal diplomacy with the Chinese President, and there is evidently good personal chemistry between these two leaders. And sometimes the personal chemistry does translate into tangible results. However, my expectations from the summit that is going to be taking place are very modest, because I do not expect a sea change in the relationship. I do not expect that that China's hostility towards us will come down in any sizable measure. However, there can be some incremental progress. For instance, in regard to people-to-people relations, there could be the question of developing more tourism between the two countries, certainly showcasing Mahabalipuram in this manner,
right,
and showing it not only on Indian television but on international television
and
will
the talk of the ties,
make
the
a difference.
historic ties
I do
between
expect
Mahabalipuram and ancient
Chinese
China.
tourists will come in.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us, General Dwivedi and Ambassador Dayal, for sharing, your thoughts on this two-day informal summit that's taking place. We'll continue to track all that's taking place right now. The beautiful Shore Temple on your screens, and this is where a cultural program will take place. Time for a break. We'll be back with more.